If you've been present in Berkshire County for the last 2 years, then rest of river agreement isn't a phrase that should be new to you. But if it is, I'll quickly say that it's the agreement made between the EPA, GE, local municipalities, and various organizations for GE's cleanup of the PCB-polluted Housatonic River. In the past 2 videos of this series, we recounted the strange, oftentimes funny, and ultimately upsetting history of the Housatonic River. This video will be different, a little more intense, and forewarning here, quite complicated. So I've divided it into 3 chapters, titled The Settlement, How We Got Here, and Chaos Absolute. The very first step will be to dive into the agreement itself, which, to be clear, has been signed off on by all necessary agents and is official pending any legal challenges, which we'll get into later. The most important aspect of the agreement is hybrid disposal. About 90% of the contaminated sediment is to be dumped locally at the now GE-owned site next to the Lane gravel pit, just over 1,000 feet from the river. This will be a state-of-the-art GE-designed disposal facility. The local dump would consist of 1 million cubic feet, roughly 1,000 school buses full, of PCB sediment that, and here's the important part, is under 50 milligrams per kilogram of PCB contamination and averaging at 25 milligrams per kilogram. Anything above that number falls under the hazardous waste categorization and therefore requires disposal at chemical waste landfills according to federal law, and therefore will be shipped out of state. Another aspect of the agreement is the commitment on GE's part to explore future technologies for treating PCBs at the dump site. This isn't a guarantee, obviously, and relies largely on the good faith of General Electric. And then there are, of course, the economic incentives. $25 million each for Lee and Lenox, $8 million for Pittsfield, and a smaller distribution for Stockbridge, Great Barrington, and Sheffield. Additionally, GE will be donating a few of its properties in Pittsfield to the city, and they will, quote, work cooperatively to enrich the recreational activities around the river. This could mean as much as a whole new bike trail, boat launch, or again, it could mean nothing as it relies on GE's good faith. There's also a section of the agreement aimed at mitigating the impact of the cleanup on the community. This means doing things like hydraulic pumping when able to keep trucks off of the streets as much as possible. And the final piece of the agreement that I want to mention is that from the moment it was signed on February 5th, 2020, GE was given the green light to begin preparations. In fact, as I understand it, there is nothing technically preventing GE from marching down to the river and starting the cleanup tomorrow. And that is basically the agreement. It's freely available on the EPA's website to view in its entirety, which I did, and I can't say I recommend it if you're looking for an engaging read. Now, before I tell you about the public reaction to this agreement, and specifically the local dumping aspect of it, it's essential that we first go back in time and talk about how the agreement came to be. The year is 2011, and the EPA has just begun to create their plan for the cleanup. During this time, they're in talks with representatives from GE, as well as Massachusetts and the general public. It takes them nearly 6 years to get the plan to a point they like, and in 2017, they show that plan to General Electric. GE, being a private corporation that wants to save every possible penny, appeals the proposed requirements of the cleanup to the U.S. Environmental Appeals Board. The appeal board sides with EPA on almost every point of contention. The one thing they don't side with them on? The requirement for out-of-state disposal. The EPA decides at this point that mediation would be the quickest, most efficient process to get all of this straightened out, and so begins 2 years of discussions between EPA, GE, Lee, Lenox, Stockbridge, Great Barrington, Sheffield, the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, the Massachusetts Audubon Society, the Citizens Rest of River Committee, and the Housatonic River Initiative. It's important for the greater story to note that these negotiations happened largely behind closed doors. And on February 5th, 2020, the agreement was signed by all of those aforementioned parties, plus the state of Connecticut and the city of Pittsfield. Well, except for one, the Housatonic River Initiative, and keep that in mind because they're going to become important in a few moments. After nearly 10 years of work, we finally had an agreement. GE was set to spend $576 million over the next 13 years to remove PCB-contaminated soil from beneath the Housatonic River and deposit 90% of that in a local dump site, shipping out the remaining 10% out of state. In the 48 hours following the February 5th signings, the world of Berkshire County entered into a whole new world. A world of absolute chaos. Immediately following the publicizing of the agreement, an outcry of opposition emerged. Social media was flooded with concerns about the safety of local dumping. Organizations were formed, signs were printed and plastered all over town. This was quickly becoming a major issue. The EPA held a series of town hall-style meetings in the coming months, which proved to be intense, to say the least. The EPA had blocked off the time period between July of 2020 and September of 2020 as the public comment period. On their website, you can find over 50 pages of transcribed voicemails that they received during this time. I skimmed through some of these, and the overwhelming majority were calling to voice their opposition with the local dump. In December of 2020, the EPA released the final version of the agreement, which didn't seem to give the public comments much consideration. They did release a few statements reassuring the safety of the local dump, but ultimately the agreement remained near identical to the draft released in February. Within a month of that final draft, legal battles started up. Remember that organization that refused to sign the final agreement, the Housatonic River Initiative? Well, they, along with the Housatonic Environmental Action League, informed the Environmental Appeals Board on January 14th that they would be appealing the agreement. 2 months later, on March 5th of 2021, they submitted that appeal on grounds that are actually quite clever. If you remember back, in 2016, the EPA themselves were opposed to local dumping. It was the reason that GE brought them to court in the first place. The opposition is now contending that the EPA flipped its position entirely without providing sufficient evidence to suggest why. The idea, in a way, seems to be to force the EPA to make an argument against their own argument by explaining why they were originally opposed to a local dump. Of course, I'm merely oversimplifying a very, very complex legal challenge. And while all that is happening, there's actually an entirely different, even more complicated legal challenge going on not in Washington, D.C., but in Lee, Massachusetts. Let's go back to 2020. In the months following the agreement, a petition is put forth in Lee for the Select Board to back out of the agreement. It's voted on and passed, but it's done so as a non-binding mandate, meaning that the Select Board doesn't have to abide by it. Or do they? That becomes the question moving forward. If you remember back a few minutes, you'll recall that the Select Board signed the agreement without a town vote of any kind. Can they do that? The Select Board and Massachusetts Attorney General say yes, but counsel representing opponents of the dump say no. Some months passed with this non-binding mandate hanging over the heads of the Lee Select Board. Opponents of the dump demanded action from their Select Board. They demanded an answer. Would they back out of the agreement? In January of 2021, the Select Board gave their answer. No. And so, a group of citizens from Lee do something that we might never see again in our lives. File a lawsuit against their own Select Board. That lawsuit is also currently ongoing. Despite all of these legal challenges up in the air, GE in May moved forward with its purchase of a 75-acre chunk from Lane Construction Corp. for $6.2 million to serve as the dump site. And the final piece of information that I can share occurred just a few weeks ago on June 25th, 2021, at Lee's annual meeting. Meeting outdoors on the Lee High School football field, town representatives voted 31-8 in favor of holding a public vote on the PCB dump. The result of this vote, asking the select board once again to back out of the agreement, however, would still be non-binding. In addition to that, the town passed a bylaw banning PCB landfills in Lee altogether. If all of that is giving you a bit of a headache, well, it probably should. It's very complicated, and at this point in time, literally anything could happen. Any of this could mean anything, really. While GE appears to be operating under the assumption that these legal challenges won't amount to anything, the opposition and its lawyers seem to think they're in a very strong position to potentially halt this agreement. The only thing that I know for sure is that we are living through a very important moment in Berkshire County history, regardless of the outcome. Through this series, I've tried to capture what I could about the earliest days of settlement along the Housatonic River. I've walked us through the development of industry and the subsequent pollution from GE and others. And most recently, I've attempted to package 2 years of debate, stress, and worry into a small, digestible package. I want to encourage you to do your own research. I've done the best I could, but it's almost a guarantee that I've missed some detail or incorrectly named some person or organization. And if you know I've done so, please let me know so I can fix it. I always wanted to end this series with an inspiring, touching speech about everything, but honestly, I'm exhausted and feeling quite drained as far as discussing all of this. So instead, here is some footage of the most beautiful toxic dump that I've ever seen.